All right, students, here we are. I'm going into period 3, 1754 to 1800. You've actually probably already started this because I asked you to watch the Tom Ritchie video on the French and Indian War and read that article, The First Real World War. And I hope that gives you a good sense. And if you notice the time period of this period that we're working on, 1754 to 1800. Well, 1776 and the Declaration of Independence is smack in the middle of this. So you're going to be able to kind of surmise that this is going to be a really, really important period that we get into. And I hope that you realized when you talked about the French and Indian War that it was really about the competition. And Tom Ritchie made a good point of saying, as long as the colonies were profitable for Great Britain, they kind of let them be. And those were all things that were familiar to you about salutary neglect and mercantilism and things like that. So, competition among the British, French, and American Indians for economic and political advantage in North America culminated in the 7 Years' War, in which Britain defeated France and allied American Indians. Now, this American Indian ally alliance is really going to be important. Now, when we talk about the 7 Years' War, if you hear it referred to as the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, it's the same thing. We consider the French and Indian War to be the part of the 7 Years' War that happened in North America, and the 7 Years' War that pretty much happened in Europe or other parts of the world. So, colonial rivalry intensified between Britain and France in the mid 18th century as the growing population of British colonies expanded in the interior, threatening French Indian trade network and American Indian autonomy. Think even back to King Philip's War. Remember, I talked about how the Native Americans felt like boxed in. Felt like they were losing out on the resources. They didn't even have enough to really support and trade with themselves. So that autonomy is going to make Native Americans want to resist against all of the French and British really trade that's happening. So the French Huron alliance, they had a strong alliance because of the fur trade network that was happening up in kind of like the Great Lakes region, Ontario, Quebec regions of Canada. The British Iroquois alliance. Now, the British and the Iroquois tended to ally together, not because they were such great friends, but because the Iroquois didn't like the Huron. It wasn't because the British and Iroquois, thought so much of each other. It was mostly because the Huron, there was, inter-tribe, or there were conflicts between tribes. And this happened to be why the Iroquois went on the side of the British, because they didn't like the Hurons, was essentially the reasoning for that. And so it results in the French and Indian War. I may have mentioned this before. I'm in a master's degree program in American history. I took a class on the American Revolution. It was only a 10-week class. We spent 3 weeks alone on the French and Indian War. It was that important. My professor hit it that hard. If you think back to the Tom Ritchie video, there was a guy standing there and he kind of had like his hand like this and he had a sword and he was all in like this red uniform and everything. That's a young George Washington. George Washington was a young officer in the French and Indian War, and what we know about Washington is it's the French and Indian War that kind of sets the tone of Washington's leadership and how things are going to go once we even get to the war for independence. So I really cannot stress the importance of the French and Indian War enough. I have got to tell you to always remember that the relationship between Native Americans and colonists was really, really important. And the relationship between the French and the Native Americans was fairly good. The relationship between the British and the Native Americans was not so good. And once the British beat the French in the French and Indian War, now the Native American tribes and populations are really going to feel like they are without an ally. Like they only have foes left. They don't have any friends left because now the French are kind of like booted back into Canada and really don't have a lot of now restrictions on trade and things like that are going to be put in place with the Treaty of Paris. And the Treaty of Paris is what officially ends the French and Indian War. Now, I'm going to talk about the Plan of the Union real briefly, and then we're going to spy a document in the next video on join or die. So first, let me just give you the Albany Plan of the Union. This was kind of dreamed up, if you will, by Benjamin Franklin. Now, this is like the Benjamin Franklin, right? He is a statesman. He's from Pennsylvania, and he says that, and he realizes this very quickly. The colonies are not going to basically be able to work together if they don't join together. Like if they're going to be continuing, you remember like the Dominion of New England? If you're all going to be like doing your own thing and you don't come together, Benjamin Franklin was the first to say, this is going to be a problem. Like we can't keep fighting Native Americans and the French and worry about all these things with Britain and our rights if we don't come together. Well, they sent this Plan of the Union to like colonial officials, and the colonies themselves didn't want to do it. They said, yeah, no. They even sent the plan to Parliament, and Parliament was like, they didn't even send it under the king. They just all said, no, it ain't going to work. We're not. Nobody really wanted to give up their perceived rights. Well, Franklin was smart enough and savvy enough to realize you're not giving up rights. You're actually gaining more. But people didn't really see it like that at the time. So the Albany Plan of the Union, think of it as like the independence movement version 1.0, and it doesn't work. They have to revise again and come up with a better plan. It's going to be a pretty costly plan, but I think if they would have listened to Ben Franklin, maybe some of that could have been avoided. Here we see probably one of the most famous pictures that comes out of the French and Indian War. His name is General Wolfe. He dies in battle on the battlefield. It's really interesting because you can see some you see officers there, you see probably normal soldiers there, but you also see a Native American man looking on and watching General Wolfe, die on the battlefield. And this is just, this is probably one of the most famous pictures of the French and Indian War. It actually happens at the Battle of Quebec, and the Battle of Quebec is kind of the final nail in the coffin, if you will, for the French. Now, General Wolfe is this is probably an Iroquois man. He's dying on battlefield, but the French and Indian War is ultimately won by the British. Okay, so Britain achieved a major expansion of its territorial holdings by defeating the French, but at tremendous expense, setting the stage for imperial efforts to raise revenue and consolidate control over the colonies. The efforts to raise revenue, wars are expensive. They had to pay for this war and consolidate control. So this is the end of salutary neglect, which we've already kind of talked about. They realized they needed to tighten restrictions. They had to have more policy put in place and actually kind of enforced. That we saw it try to be done in the Navigation Acts. Sometimes it worked. Then they tried to crack down on smuggling. Colonists didn't like it. They apply writs of assistance. A writ is just like a written command, like a legal notice, kind of like. And some of the writs of assistance said British officials could search like any merchant or any vessel, I guess I should say. Essentially, it said British officials could look at and interrogate and confiscate and do whatever they want if they thought that the colonial merchant the British colonists wasn't following policy. Well, this gives us a pretty good indication of what's going to come. The Admiralty Courts. The Admiralty Court said if you were like, if they thought that you were smuggling or weren't following the law and you were trying to like get around some of the trade restrictions or whatever, and they thought you were guilty, they would send you to England to be tried in a court in England. Like you weren't tried in a court of law in America, they sent you to England. Well, that should also give us an idea of, okay, well, like the Sixth Amendment, like you should be tried in a fair trial with a jury of your peers. So these are all things that are, just naturally happening at this time because the end of salutary neglect. Now they're trying to tighten control and consolidate that control to raise revenue because wars are expensive. And that 7 Years' War lasted a long time. The French and Indian War lasted in the United States almost 9 years. Virtual representation in Parliament. This was basically the Britain's way of saying, you colonists, you don't need to have representation physically in Parliament because we already represent you. Like just being a British citizen, you already have representation in Parliament. So there's no need to send delegates to Britain because we already represent you. Well, the colonists were like, yeah, but you don't even know what's going on in British America. Like you don't even know what's going on in the colonies. So how can you say you represent us when you really don't? Once again, the idea, if you've ever heard, kind of the slogan, no taxation without representation, is going to come into play here in the next couple of decades. There's a guy, he's one who attaches the writs of assistant, and he goes looking for essentially merchants who are not following the law, and he does illegal search and seizures, more or less. Okay, so after the British victory, imperial officers attempted to prevent colonists from moving westward. Okay, this is important. The British wanted to stop colonists from moving westward, and that generates colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachments of colonists on tribal lands. So we're going to look at a map of Pontiac's Rebellion in the next video after we go through the kind of the Albany Plan of the Union and another spy document, and the Proclamation of 1763. Okay, so let me set the stage for you here. Pontiac is a very big tribal chief up in kind of the Great Lakes region, near what we consider today to be Michigan. Well, Chief Pontiac, and it wasn't really his doing, but Chief Pontiac, they kind of decide to get their act together. A whole bunch of Native American groups try to get their act together because they realize they don't have a friend, and the British are pretty much going to continue to encroach on them. And so Pontiac's Rebellion shows us a lot up in Fort Detroit, and we're going to look at a map here of really what needed to happen. First and foremost, it's that the tribes were going to come together to resist colonial forces. Now they don't have the friendship of the French anymore. And so now we start seeing less bickering and hatred between tribes and more, we got to stick together because we are not going to beat the British alone. Okay, so that's the first thing that we understand of Pontiac's Rebellion. The second thing we understand of Pontiac's Rebellion is that it brings out the Proclamation of 1763. I absolutely, positively need you to know this, love it, learn it, live it, star it, know the Proclamation of 1763. If in my description you still don't really get it, go and read about it. You should for sure be reading, watch a video on it, whatever it needs to be. The Proclamation of 1763 was the British proclamation that said, colonists, we are really tired of paying for all these skirmishes and battles and rebellions that keep cropping up between Native Americans and colonists, and so we are not going to let you move past this, like, imaginary line. So think of where the Appalachian Mountains are, right? You can picture the Appalachian Mountains. Remember when we did our geography quiz? They kind of made a line through the Appalachian Mountains that said, colonists, you're not going to be able to move anywhere west of this area because west of that area are lots of Native American groups, and we don't have the money or the time or the resources to continue to put down these rebellions and skirmishes that the Native American groups have now done because they're getting their acts together against us. So you can't move any further. Well, you can about imagine as more and more colonists are coming into North America, into the colonies, they got to find somewhere to live, and they've always gone westward. It's always been this westward movement. But now the proclamation, this imaginary line, said you can't move past there. So this is a big deal. The British are now forced to not only try to get along with the Native Americans, but they're also putting restrictions on colonial movement westward. Okay, that's a really important point. The Iroquois Confederacy. This is a large group of 5 different tribal groups that got together to make a large Native American alliance for that very reason, because together we can be stronger than if we're all divided and doing our own thing. We have to somehow stop these colonists from continuing to take our land, to take our resources, to cheat us out of whatever agreements that we make. And then Chief Little Turtle and the Western Confederacy. I'm not going to get into this a whole lot. Know that Chief Little Turtle was, again, we're talking in the Ohio River Valley, the importance of the Ohio River Valley, which, by the way, you would have picked up on in the Tom Ritchie video with the French and Indian War. That was such a critical area for all groups, really. And so Chief Little Turtle is a Miami, Ohio chief, and the Western Confederacy. Unfortunately, the Western Confederacy kind of falls and succumbs to British advances, and they have to sign a Treaty of Greenville. That will be coming later. So at this point, that's all I wanted to get through. Please tune in to the next video where I'm going to spy that document on Join or Die, the first political cartoon, and talk about Pontiac's Rebellion a little bit more. So we'll see you next time.